Imagine standing at the edge of a place on Earth where the echoes of the Cold War are still, well, incredibly loud. This place is a narrow strip of land just a couple of miles wide, slicing right across a peninsula. It's a paradox, really. On one hand, it's overgrown with wildflowers, a quiet sanctuary for rare birds like the red-crowned cranes, a real haven for wildlife. And on the other hand, it's this intensely militarized zone, bristling with razor wire, landmines, and the most powerful concentration of opposing military forces anywhere in the world, many on, like, hair trigger alert. This is the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, dividing North and South Korea. President Bill Clinton famously called it the Cold War's last divide back in '97. That visual contrast between nature thriving and humanity just poised for conflict is, well, it's just astonishing.
It is, yeah, and it really captures the enduring tension and the complex, often contradictory reality of the Korean Peninsula. It's a very powerful image to start with when you're trying to understand this region.
Absolutely. And that complexity, the layers of history, tension, and even, surprising moments of attempted reconciliation, that's precisely what we're embarking on a deep dive into today. We're going deep into excerpts from Don Oberdorfer's really significant book, The Two Koreas, a contemporary history.
Right. And Oberdorfer, he wasn't just writing history from, secondary sources. He was really uniquely positioned to report and analyze it. He was a veteran journalist for the Washington Post, served as their Northeast Asia correspondent during a really crucial period, 72 to 75, and as a diplomatic correspondent for 17 years.
Yeah.
So he was effectively a witness to many of the key events he describes in the book.
Wow.
Yeah, think about the access he had. He met every South Korean president except the first one, Syngman Rhee. And he also cultivated extensive contacts with high-level North Korean officials. He met their foreign minister or senior deputies almost every year, often at the UN, and even made these rare visits to North Korea himself in 1991 and again in January 1995.
So this isn't just academic analysis, though it's definitely rigorously researched. It's history informed by years of firsthand observation and, well, deep direct access to the key players.
Exactly. Oberdorfer saw a real gap. He felt there wasn't a comprehensive contemporary history of this ongoing conflict and the complicated efforts towards conciliation, especially one that adequately highlighted the crucial roles played by the external powers, the U.S., China, the Soviet Union, which became Russia, and Japan. So to fix this, he didn't just rely on his own extensive reporting. He conducted over 450 interviews across multiple countries and really dug into significant archival materials from the U.S., Russia, and even East Germany.
That breadth of research, combining reporting, interviews, archives, it gives the book a really unique depth and perspective, doesn't it?
It really does. And our mission today, for you listening, is to take that incredibly rich resource and extract the core arguments, the pivotal historical events, the major figures, the key turning points, and really trace the evolution of the North-South dynamic as Oberdorfer presents it. It's about offering you a sort of curated shortcut to understanding this complex, vital relationship, all based on his work.
A shortcut that feels particularly necessary, given how incredibly intricate this story is. And just a quick note on names, as we'll be mentioning a lot of Korean figures. We'll generally follow the common East Asian practice where surnames come first, so you'll hear Kim Il-sung or Kim Young-sam. We'll stick to this format unless a figure is much more widely known otherwise, like, say, South Korea's first president, Syngman Rhee.
Right. And grasping this history, the roots of this enduring tension and the often frustrated attempts to bridge the divide, it's incredibly relevant right now. The Korean Peninsula remains a geopolitical flashpoint strategically located right at the heart of Northeast Asia, surrounded by major global powers like China, Japan, Russia, and of course the United States. The past here isn't just history, it's constantly shaping the present and really influencing the future.
Okay, let's really unpack this story then. Let's start at what many Koreans view as a foundational injustice, something they sometimes even call the Second American Betrayal.
Yes, the division of the peninsula right at the end of World War II. It's a point of really deep historical pain for Koreans. If you go back to 1943, the Cairo Declaration promised Korea would become free and independent, although it had that vague qualifier, in due course.
In due course. Always vague.
Exactly. Then, at Yalta in 1945, President Roosevelt suggested a post-war trusteeship involving the U.S., the Soviets, and China. But beyond those few pronouncements, there was almost no practical planning in Washington for Korea's post-war future. Oberdorfer even shares his story, maybe apocryphal, but tells you something, about Secretary of State Stettinius asking an aide in a meeting in 1945, "Please tell me where Korea was."
Wow. That anecdote alone speaks volumes about the lack of focus on Korea's future as the war was ending.
It really does. And this lack of planning led directly to a hasty, almost panicked decision in the final days of the war. On the evening of August 10th, 1945, Japan was effectively suing for peace. Soviet troops were already advancing rapidly into Korea from the north. A late-night meeting was called in Washington. The immediate urgent task was, how do we accept the Japanese surrender in Korea in a way that prevents the Soviets from potentially occupying the entire peninsula? That would bring them uncomfortably close to Japan. So around midnight, two relatively junior officers, Lieutenant Colonels Dean Rusk, who later became Secretary of State, of course, and Charles Bonesteel, who would later command U.S. forces in Korea. They were sent into an adjoining room. They were given very little preparation and, incredibly, used a National Geographic map as their main reference.
So this incredibly consequential decision, which has shaped the peninsula for, almost 80 years now, it was effectively made in a matter of hours by two junior officers using a magazine map. That's just mind-blowing.
It is. Working under immense pressure, they quickly proposed that U.S. troops occupy the area south of the 38th parallel. They chose this line because it roughly divided the peninsula in half, and crucially, it put the capital city, Seoul, firmly in the American zone. The Soviets would occupy the area north of that line to accept the Japanese surrender. The proposal was accepted and quickly communicated to the Soviets.
What this crucial rushed decision really tells us is how profoundly important and lasting historical divisions can be set by seemingly tactical, short-term decisions made under pressure with, limited information. It wasn't driven by some grand strategic vision for Korea's future independence, was it?
Not at all. It was a short-term geopolitical calculation about Soviet influence. Pure and simple. So, following Japan's surrender, the two zones solidified. By late 1948, Soviet troops withdrew from the north, having helped establish the Kim Il-sung regime. The following June 1949, U.S. troops also withdrew from the south. Both sides left behind governments and nascent militaries that they had significantly shaped and supported.
Right.
And before the summer of 1949 was even over, civil war was already breaking out in substantial clashes, sometimes involving battalion-sized units, all along that arbitrary 38th parallel. Both the North and South were actively building up their forces, each side nurturing ambitions of unifying the country under their own rule, by force if necessary.
And that escalating tension and military buildup tragically exploded into the Korean War.
It did. On June 25, 1950, North Korea launched a full-scale invasion of the South, aimed at reunifying the country by force. They had backing from the Soviet Union and, somewhat less directly at first, from China. This invasion prompted a rapid response from the UN Security Council, leading to a counter-invasion under the UN flag. This involved not just the United States and South Korea, but troops from 15 other nations.
15 other nations, wow.
Yeah. The war saw these dramatic swings, with UN forces pushing deep into the north, before China intervened massively in late 1950, with hundreds of thousands of so-called volunteer troops to prevent the collapse of the North Korean regime.
So this wasn't simply a civil conflict. It immediately became a major international proxy war of the nascent Cold War.
Absolutely. And the war had monumental and lasting global consequences that went far beyond the peninsula itself. For the United States, it marked a decisive shift. They went from post-WWII demobilization and disarmament to a massive, sustained rearmament effort, explicitly aimed at containing perceived Soviet and Chinese expansionism. U.S. military spending tripled almost overnight. Troop presence in Europe doubled. It fundamentally solidified NATO's military posture.
Right.
The war also cemented a critical alliance between the Soviet Union and China for nearly a decade, and turned the U.S. and China into bitter enemies for over 20 years. Perhaps most crucially for the global stage, the brutal battle for Korea firmly established the Cold War as a hot, violent reality and placed the Korean peninsula right at its enduring center.
After 3 years of just brutal fighting, the shooting finally stopped in July 1953 with an armistice agreement.
It stopped, yeah, but it wasn't a peace treaty. The front line stabilized almost exactly where it started, near the 38th parallel. The armistice agreement established that 2,000-meter-wide demilitarized zone we started with. And importantly, while both sides were utterly exhausted, the fundamental political and ideological conflict was completely unresolved, leaving this deep-seated fear that the conflict could just resume at any moment.
And the human cost of the war. It went far deeper than the military casualties, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. One of the most profound and tragic legacies of the war was how it hardened the ideological and political lines between North and South. The antipathy between the regimes wasn't just abstract politics. It descended into what Oberdorfer describes as a blood feud among family members.
A blood feud.
Yeah. Ordinary people on both sides had suffered terrible atrocities at the hands of the other, often by fellow Koreans just wearing different uniforms. This experience didn't just divide the country politically, it shattered the 1,300-year-old unity of the Korean people, cutting brutally through families, communities, and the shared identity of the nation. That deep wound from this period, it has never truly healed.
That legacy of division and suffering brings us to the tumultuous post-war period, particularly in the South, under the leadership of Park Chung-hee.
Park Chung-hee. He came to power through a military coup in 1961, with key figures like Roh Tae-woo playing a supportive role. His background presented a really striking contrast to North Korea's Kim Il-sung. Kim was, lionized as an anti-Japanese guerrilla fighter. Park, however, had attended the Japanese military academy during the colonial period, served in the Japanese army, and even took a Japanese name, Masao Takagi, as was required then. There's also this disputed episode in his past where he was arrested in 1948 as the leader of a communist cell within the South Korean military, sentenced to death. His sentence was commuted by President Syngman Rhee, reportedly partly on the recommendation of Rhee's shrewd U.S. military advisor, James Houseman, who saw Park's potential as a damned good soldier. Park then famously switched sides, becoming an intelligence official tasked with hunting down communists. So he was a complex, controversial, and highly pragmatic figure right from the start of his political career.
Under Park, South Korea embarked on this dramatic push for rapid economic development.
Yes, this was his defining mission after consolidating power. He aggressively pushed for state-led industrialization, particularly through ambitious projects like the Heavy and Chemical Plan in the 1970s. This plan laid the foundation for South Korea's later dominance in key industries like automobiles, shipbuilding, electronics.
The K-ball system really took off then.
It did. However, Oberdorfer, referencing analysis by economist Cho Soon, notes that this rapid development came with significant costs and faced criticism. The scale of the projects often exceeded by far what the country could accommodate. Government direction substituted for private initiative, leading to waste and distortions, inflationary pressure. The rise of these immense politically connected conglomerates, the key ball, as you said, in widening income inequality. Still, the economic growth was undeniable and truly remarkable. South Korea's real GNP tripled between 1965 and 1976, vastly outpacing the North's, which only doubled. By the mid-1970s, the South had achieved a higher per capita GNP, a critical psychological and material turning point.
Economic growth was a focus, but military spending remained incredibly high on both sides, didn't it? Fueled by that post-war tension.
Oh, definitely. From the mid-60s to the mid-70s, North Korea reportedly devoted a massive and, frankly, unsustainable 15–20% of its entire economy to the military. South Korea's spending was lower, averaging around 5%, but under Park, it also jumped significantly, getting closer to 10% in the mid-70s. This reflected the perceived constant threat from the North and Park's drive for self-sufficiency.
Then, in 1972, Park consolidated his power even further through the implementation of the Yushin system.
Yes, the revitalizing reform system. Park justified this dramatic shift towards authoritarian rule by arguing the nation needed to be absolutely strong and united internally to face the constant threat from the North, and also to maintain independence in a rapidly changing international environment, where he feared the interests of smaller countries like Korea could be sacrificed by the big powers. This view was really amplified by the U.S. rapprochement with China. But, as the astute U.S. Ambassador William Porter and later Ambassador Richard Habib assessed in cables back to Washington, the real, unmistakable purpose of the Yushin system was, quote, to ensure that President Park will stay in office for at least 12 years, with even less opposition and dissent, and with increased executive powers. It essentially created a completely authoritarian government, which Ambassador Habib actually believed was objectively unnecessary from a national security standpoint, though certainly politically convenient for Park.
And this authoritarian system came with significant suppression of dissent, particularly hitting the press hard.
Absolutely. The security organs, especially the powerful Korean Central Intelligence Agency, the KCIA, worked relentlessly to stifle any independent voice in the media. KCI operatives would go daily to major newspapers and broadcast stations, literally dictating what news could be reported, even specifying headline size and prominence. If editors or reporters showed any resistance or failed to comply fully, they were routinely called in for harsh interrogation and often physically beaten. It was a system of tight, very visible control.
Within this repressive environment, Park's most prominent and persistent opposition figure was Kim Dae-jung.
Kim Dae-jung, yes. A highly articulate, charismatic politician, a favorite son of the traditionally rebellious Chola provinces in the southwest. He He was a strong voice for democracy and unification, and he actually accurately predicted before the 1971 election that if Park won, he would transform into a generalissimo. Kim was fortunate, in a way, to be in Japan when the Yushin crackdown began, allowing him to escape the initial wave of arrests and continue his criticism from abroad.
But he didn't escape entirely.
No, tragically not. In 1973, he became the victim of a brazen act of state-sponsored kidnapping from Tokyo by KCIA agents. This was a clear violation of Japanese sovereignty and caused a huge international outcry. Domestically, it was a major turning point, significantly galvanizing anti-Park forces both within South Korea and among expatriate communities abroad.
Interestingly, at the same time Park was consolidating authoritarian power internally, he seemed to be losing trust in his key external ally, the United States.
Yes, there's a striking account of this related by his aide, Kim Song-jin. When Henry Kissinger's secret trip to China was announced in 1971, Park reportedly took this as a direct message that the U.S. might not necessarily come to South Korea's rescue if North Korea invaded again. He complained privately to reporters that the U.S. was making all the concessions to Beijing without consulting or considering Seoul, and saw Nixon's planned visit to China primarily as a domestic maneuver for re-election. The pressing fundamental question for him became, how long can we trust the United States? This declining trust likely contributed to his later push for a clandestine nuclear weapons program.
Despite this backdrop of internal repression and external mistrust, there were initial tentative attempts at dialogue between North and South around this time, weren't there?
That's right. Even before the surprise of Kissinger's secret trip to China, North Korea had sent sort of discreet feelers for direct talks. Following Kim Il-sung's unexpected announcement on August 6, 1971, that he was ready for discussions, the South quickly proposed Red Cross talks to discuss divided families, which the North immediately accepted. The first exploratory discussions between representatives of the two Red Cross societies took place in Panmunjom on August 20, 1971. This was a significant moment, the first such official contact 18 years after the armistice.
What were those early talks like, particularly when the North Korean delegation actually visited Seoul?
They were a strange mix of formality, political maneuvering, and almost surreal interactions. When the North Korean delegation visited Seoul, they were treated to this elaborate reception at the historic Gyeongbok Palace in a beautiful pavilion called the Pavilion of Joyous Meeting. The arrangements, which Oberdorfer suggests were devised by the KCIA, were designed to impress and perhaps subtly influence the visitors. They included a lavish buffet and dozens of young women described as Red Cross volunteers, many in modern, kind of alluring clothes. Oberdorfer recounts asking one of them who she was and why she was there, and she just firmly replied, "I'm a Red Cross volunteer," refusing further questions. He learned from a South Korean journalist that the KCIA had orchestrated these arrangements, apparently to show off the South's prosperity and modern lifestyle.
But the underlying political tension was intense.
Oh, absolutely. And it quickly broke through the surface. The opening ceremony, held in a hotel ballroom in Seoul, was televised live throughout the South. The South Korean government basically gambled that the North Koreans' highly ideological rhetoric would alienate the generally conservative South Korean public, who, while desiring unification, deeply feared communism after the devastation of the war. And this is exactly what happened. The North Korean political advisor, Yoon Ki-bok, launched into this lengthy, fiery speech that attacked the United States, praised the nation's glorious capital, Pyongyang, and lauded the great leader, Kim Il-sung.
And the reaction in the South was immediate and visceral.
Completely. Within minutes of the speech, hundreds of telephone calls flooded the television station and police switchboards, expressing outrage and protest. The mood in the South shifted abruptly from cautious hope to palpable anger. When the North Koreans left the hotel after the ceremony, they encountered silence instead of the polite applause they'd received earlier. A delegate waved to the crowd and nobody waved back. President Park Chung-hee, despite the public anger, wisely decided not to clash sharply with the visitors during their stay, wanting to avoid collapsing the talks right away. The core insight from these early attempts at dialogue, according to Oberdorfer, is that despite the public show, neither Kim Il-sung nor Park Chung-hee was genuinely willing to seriously compromise the fundamental basis of their own regimes for the sake of unity on the other's terms. Their governments had been shaped and legitimized by this very rivalry and fierce opposition to the other side's system. Without a strong, coordinated push from external powers who themselves had conflicting interests and weren't really prioritizing Korean unity, the dialogue just lacked the necessary momentum and political will to be sustained and achieve any meaningful breakthrough beyond minor humanitarian exchanges.
Beyond the diplomatic facade, Pyongyang was also very active militarily throughout the 1970s, maintaining a constant threat.
They were. In May 1972, Kim Il-sung himself, speaking to New York Times reporters, gave this chillingly frank statement about their military posture. He said that due to the continuing U.S. attitude and presence, quote, "We frankly tell you, we are always making preparations for war. We do not conceal this matter." Even with the U.S.-China rapprochement happening, Beijing quietly renewed significant military assistance to North Korea in the early 1970s. A particularly alarming discovery in this period was the network of infiltration tunnels being dug by North Korea under the demilitarized zone.
These tunnels sound incredibly sophisticated and concerning.
They were. The U.S. and South Korean forces eventually discovered several of them. They were surprisingly well constructed, about 4 feet high, 3 feet wide, reinforced concrete walls, electric lines for lighting, and even a narrow-gauge railway with carts to facilitate movement and debris removal. The U.S. command calculated that they could rapidly squeeze about 2,000 troops through a single tunnel from its source in the north to a planned exit south of the DMZ, and then bring additional troops through at a rate of 500 to 700 men per hour. This presented a new and significant threat of a surprise attack designed to bypass the South's forward defense lines and emerge behind them. It showed a serious, sustained military strategy aimed at the South.
The mid-1970s also saw South Korea expressing concerns about the strength of the U.S. commitment, particularly as events unfolded in Southeast Asia with the collapse of South Vietnam.
Yet, that situation in Vietnam deeply worried President Park and prompted the U.S. ambassador in Seoul, Richard Snyder, to appeal urgently to Washington in April 1975 for a review of U.S. policies. He noted declining ROK confidence in the U.S. commitment and assessed there was a risk of North Korean provocation designed to test both U.S. intentions and South Korean capabilities in this uncertain environment. Snyder recommended confidence-building measures, including increased weapons and economic support for Seoul and contingency planning for special U.S. air and naval deployments in case of a serious threat, emphasizing the need for a strong, visible commitment.
Meanwhile, Park Chung-hee was also pursuing a highly secret and, well, dangerous initiative on the nuclear front.
Yes, a serious clandestine effort to develop South Korea's own nuclear bomb capability. According to a senior advisor on nuclear and military production, Oh Chol, this effort began after a particularly frustrating incident in June 1970, where faster, better-armed North Korean speedboats overwhelmed and captured a South Korean patrol boat. Weeks later, Park was genuinely shocked and angered by the Nixon administration's decision to withdraw the U.S. 7th Division from South Korea, despite his vehement protests. Park became convinced that the South Korean army, with its outmoded arms, simply couldn't defend itself effectively alone against the North. Oh Chol stated that while Park hadn't made a final decision to produce a bomb, he was absolutely determined to acquire the necessary technology and capability to do so on very short notice, much like he believed Japan could. Park wished to have the nuclear card to deal with other governments because, as O observed, the capability to produce nuclear weapons is almost as potent as possession of the bomb itself in international bargaining.
One of the most dangerous flashpoints of this era, vividly illustrating the hair-trigger nature of the DMZ, was the poplar tree incident in 1976.
Oh, this incident came dangerously close to igniting a wider conflict. It started subtly but escalated really quickly. On August 5th, the day before the initial attempt to trim the tree that caused the dispute, North Korea issued this highly unusual and alarming government statement, charging the U.S. and South Korea with stepping up invasion plans and saying they were going to directly ignite the fuse of war. Despite this explicit threat, the first attempt to trim the poplar tree in the Joint Security Area, JSA, at Panmunjom happened the very next day, August 6th.
And then came the deadly confrontation.
On August 18th, when American officers went out again with a work party to trim that same poplar tree, which was obstructing the view between UN checkpoints, North Korean guards suddenly attacked the work party, killing 2 American officers with axes and wounding several ROK soldiers and U.S. enlisted men. The U.S. response was immediate and massive. Operation Paul Bunyan. It was a huge, heavily armed show of force involving hundreds of U.S. and ROK troops, including special forces with axes, all backed by B-52 bombers flying from Guam and naval assets positioned off the coast. They successfully cut the tree down without direct North Korean military opposition, although the tension was just sky high.
Discussions in Washington during this crisis must have been incredibly serious.
They were. A high-level meeting called the WASAG, the Washington Special Actions Group, a crisis management committee chaired by Henry Kissinger or his deputy, was held. While they approved Operation Paul Bunyan, There was intense debate about potential punitive military actions beyond just cutting the tree. Options discussed included laying mines, seizing a North Korean ship, and astonishingly, one participant reportedly suggested exploding a nuclear weapon at sea near the North Korean coast as a warning.
Wow, seriously?
Yeah. Kissinger himself seemed interested in a limited airstrike, suggesting one in the eastern part of the DMZ as it would be unexpected and potentially containable.
How did North Korea react on the ground to this massive display of force?
Well, while they didn't directly engage during Operation Paul Bunyan, their frontline troops were prepared for battle, and senior officials in Pyongyang were evacuated into fortified tunnels, anticipating potential U.S. retaliation. Foreign Minister Ho Dam depicted the killings at a non-aligned movement summit as intentional provocation. However, perhaps realizing how close they had come to disaster, North Korea also quickly agreed to a military armistice commission meeting and suggested to General Stilwell, the U.S. commander, that the killings might have been a spontaneous, low-level overreaction by local guards.
What this incident really highlights is the immense potential for relatively minor incidents in the DMZ to just escalate rapidly into wider conflict, and how calculated shows of force, while risky, can sometimes diffuse a crisis, though they required agonizingly high-stakes decisions at the highest levels.
Exactly. And Brent Scowcraft's view, noted by Oberdorfer, is that had a war been sparked in August 1976, just 3 months before the U.S. presidential election, it could conceivably have changed the outcome, favoring Gerald Ford over Jimmy Carter. It's a chilling thought about the potential ripple effects of events on the peninsula.
The Park Chung-hee era, which began with a coup, ultimately ended in violence as well.
Yes, with his assassination on October 26, 1979. For months leading up to it, tension had been building significantly due to escalating political struggle and increasingly widespread protests, particularly after the lingering outrage over the Kim Dae-jung kidnapping. Opposition from students, intellectuals, and the Christian community had been growing bolder. The assassination happened during a dinner following criticism of KCIA director Kim Jae-kyu by Park and his hardline chief bodyguard, Cha Ji-chul. Kim Jae-kyu left the room, retrieved his pistol, and shot both Park Chung-hee and Cha Ji-chul.
A sudden, dramatic, and unexpected end to an 18-year rule.
It was, though the source notes that Kim Jae-kyu's pistol misfired initially. And more importantly, he didn't have a serious, well-thought-out plan for taking over the government after the assassination, despite arranging to meet the Army Chief of Staff. His motives are complex and debated. Certainly fear of dismissal played a role, as did personal clashes with the aggressive Cha Ji-chul. But intriguingly, Oberdorfer notes that Kim Jae-kyu may have misread American attitudes towards Park. Kim had access to negative information about Park circulating in the U.S. and may have convinced himself that his action, ending Park's authoritarian rule, would actually be welcomed by the Americans.
Really?
Yeah. As Ambassador Gleastein put it, he believed the assassination resulted from some kind of madness, but that American behavior inadvertently fed it. Gleastein felt Kim Jae-kyu misread us, thinking the U.S. saw him as a white hat working for good, when in reality the U.S. saw him as a white hat on a black head, potentially a decent individual, but part of a repressive system. This misreading contributed to his crazy decision.
After Park's death, what was the immediate reaction like in South Korea and the U.S.?
An emergency cabinet meeting quickly named Prime Minister Choi Sool acting president. Martial law was declared nationwide, a move the U.S. concurred with. Army Chief of Staff Chung Seung-hwa was named martial law commander. American officials who flew in for Park's elaborate funeral, despite huge crowds attending, noted surprisingly little sincere grief among the general public, or many officials they spoke with. As a senior South Korean official told Assistant Secretary of State Richard Holbrooke simply, his time had come. And Holbrooke observed that among the people who mattered in Seoul, there wasn't a wet eye in Seoul.
Suggests a widespread, quiet relief, maybe.
It does suggest that a quiet relief after years of authoritarian rule, despite the violent end. In Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung reacted cautiously. He approved the elimination of the traitor Park, but stated, "We must wait and see what change this will bring about," while also heightening North Korea's military readiness, mirroring the actions taken in the South. The U.S. command and the Carter administration remained concerned about potential North Korean attempts to exploit the turmoil, though none materialized immediately.
The post-Park transition was brief, quickly leading to another military takeover.
Yes, the December 12, 1979 takeover, led by Major General Chun Do-hwan, head of the Defense Security Command, and a group of younger, ambitious officers, often referred to as Young Turks. Roh Tae-woo, who had later become president himself, played an essential supporting role. notably bringing his 9th Infantry Division troops to Seoul without authorization from the Combined Forces Command. Ambassador Glaystein reported to Washington that this was effectively a coup in all but name, achieved as an accomplished fact before the U.S. could effectively react or intervene. It generated deep animosities within the military and set a dangerous precedent for insubordination, particularly concerning the U.S.-led Combined Forces Command structure, which was technically in charge of RK forces during wartime conditions.
What was Chin's background, and how did he view the U.S. compared to Park?
Chung had spent a year in American military schools at places like Fort Bragg and Fort Benning. While he had tenuous English, this experience gave him a sense of familiarity with the U.S. and Americans that the Japanese-educated Park Chung-hee lacked. Unlike Park, Chun felt he knew Americans and could deal with them directly without relying on interpreters or intermediaries. He famously recounted being deeply impressed by an anecdote about an American driver stopping meticulously for a traffic light late at night in a small town, which Chun saw as evidence of the American law-abiding spirit he believed was essential for freedom and democracy.
What this period demonstrates, much like the 1961 coup, is the limited extent of genuine U.S. leverage on South Korean political developments, isn't it?
That's clearly a key takeaway from Oberdorfer's account. Just as in 1961, the December 1979 military takeover was a fait accompli before the United States could truly react effectively. The U.S. Embassy's brief, unsuccessful attempt to reverse the 1961 coup by supporting the elected government had been an embarrassing failure, and it served as a cautionary reminder of the inherent limits of American influence when domestic military forces are determined to seize power.
This period under Chun also saw the brutal suppression of the Gwangju Uprising in May 1980.
Yes, this is a very dark chapter in South Korean history. Following Park's death, there was a brief relaxation of repression, coinciding with some economic difficulties and partial martial law still in effect. Opposition politicians became more vocal, and student demonstrations, which were traditional in the spring, grew significantly, demanding the lifting of martial law and early democratic elections. Chun, using his martial law powers and consolidating control from his position as head of the Defense Security Command, was named acting KCIA director in mid-April. This move convinced the U.S. Embassy he was determined to take over the presidency. Washington responded with a gesture of disapproval, indefinitely postponing the annual security consultative meeting with South Korea. But the crackdown came anyway in May, leading to the brutal, widely condemned suppression of the uprising in Gwangju, a city known for its democratic activism.
The issue of human rights in South Korea became a point of clear contrast between the Carter and Reagan administrations' foreign policy approaches.
It did. President Carter had emphasized human rights globally, often leading to friction with authoritarian allies like Park Chung-hee. At the Seoul meeting between outgoing President Carter and incoming President Reagan in November 1980, Carter thanked Reagan for privately urging Chun Doo-hwan to spare the life of opposition leader Kim Dae-jung, who had been sentenced to death. Reagan, who had been silent up to that point, reportedly startled Carter by exclaiming, "Mr. President, I'd like to have the power that Korean presidents have to draft dissenters."
Wow.
Yeah. This anecdote, included in the source, starkly highlights the fundamental difference in their approaches to human rights and dealing with allied strongmen.
In a strange counterpoint to the brutality at home and incidents like the Rangoon bombing plot in 1983, North Korea also pursued a surprising diplomatic initiative around this time.
That's right. It seems almost contradictory. On October 8, 1983, the day before North Korean agents attempted to assassinate South Korean ministers in Rangoon, Burma, North Korea, made a significant diplomatic proposal. For the first time, they proposed three-way talks involving the U.S. and South Korea, explicitly accepting Seoul as a full and equal participant. This was a major departure from their previous policy of trying to sideline or ignore the South Korean government in favor of direct talks with the United States. While the Rangoon bombing overshadowed it, this proposal laid some groundwork for their diplomacy for the rest of the decade.
And this opening led to some surprising humanitarian and economic talks in 1984 and 1985.
Yeah, a potential opening appeared when South Korea sent flood relief goods to the North in September 1984. The North Korean Red Cross chairman seized on this, urging using this successful exchange to launch multi-sided collaboration in various fields. This led to North-South economic talks and the resumption of Red Cross talks focused on divided families. Over about a year, they held 13 public discussions across different formats: economic, Red Cross, and parliamentary preparatory contacts. A tangible and deeply emotional payoff came in September 1985 with the family reunions, where 35 South Koreans visited Pyongyang and 30 North Koreans visited Seoul. After decades of absolute separation, seeing even a small number of divided families reunite offered a poignant moment of hope and a promise of potentially better times.
There were also attempts at highly secret summit diplomacy around this time.
President Chun Doo-hwan had repeatedly proposed a summit with Kim Il-sung. To explore this possibility, a secret North Korean delegation headed by Ho-dam visited Seoul in September 1985 and met Chun Doo-hwan at a private mansion. Chun, having heard persistent reports that Kim Il-sung had 7 luxurious mansions, apparently wanted to show that he too had impressive accommodations for high-level visitors. The North Koreans brought a letter from Kim Il-sung to Chun. There were later secret meetings involving high-level officials from both sides, including South Korea's NSP director Soo Dong-kwon meeting Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il in Pyongyang, and North Korea's Yoon Ki-bok meeting Roh Tae-woo in Seoul. Soo later claimed these contacts came very close to an agreement on a summit, although another official quoted disputes how close they actually were.
The external relations of both Koreas were also undergoing significant changes, particularly with the Soviet Union and China, which increasingly impacted the dynamics on the peninsula.
The mid-1980s saw an improvement in the relationship between the USSR and the DPRK, leading to increased Soviet military aid to North Korea. General Secretary Chernenko reportedly promised 60 advanced MiG-25 fighters, seen as a major technological leap for the North, as well as SAM-3 anti-aircraft missiles and SDD missiles. This was partly in response to the U.S. supplying F-16 fighter jets to South Korea.
And Kim Il-sung met Gorbachev in Moscow in October 1986.
Yes, Kim flew to Moscow, hoping to persuade Gorbachev to press the U.S. on troop and nuclear withdrawal from the South. He exaggerated the situation in the South, claiming there was a big movement in favor of socialism in the South. Kim was also concerned that North Korean interests might be ignored or sacrificed in the growing Soviet-American dialogue, just as he felt they had been in the Sino-American dialogue since the early 1970s.
What were Gorbachev's private views on Kim Il-sung and North Korea?
According to his aide, Vadim Medvedev, Gorbachev made a surprisingly warm declaration of solidarity with Kim in their meeting, possibly due to domestic criticism he faced after the failed Reykjavik summit with Reagan. However, in private, according to Anatoly Chernyaev, Gorbachev's national security assistant, Gorbachev had an ironical attitude toward Kim's claims and personality cult, and considered him a burden to the Soviet Union. Despite these private misgivings, Oberdorfer notes that Gorbachev viewed North Korea as a privileged ally due to long-standing socialist ties and treaties, which paradoxically led the Soviets to fulfill virtually all of Pyongyang's wishes for weapons deliveries and economic help, straining Soviet resources.
But Gorbachev's broader foreign policy, particularly perestroika, started to shift the Soviet approach towards South Korea.
A clear public signal of this shift came in Gorbachev's important September 1988 Krasnoyarsk speech, where he explicitly addressed the possibility of developing economic ties with South Korea for the first time publicly. He also proposed a 5-power initiative involving the USSR, China, Japan, North Korea, and South Korea to discuss limiting and reducing military forces in the region. It's interesting to note that South Korea's President Roh Tae-woo, in his October 1988 UN speech, called for a remarkably similar consultative conference for peace involving those same 5 powers plus the United States, a resemblance pointed out by the Soviet ambassador to the U.S.
Economically, the gap between North and South was widening dramatically throughout the 1980s, highlighting the South's growing strength and the North's stagnation.
Oh, yeah. By 1988, South Korea's GNP was at least 7 times larger than the North's, and that disparity was growing rapidly. The Soviet Union was increasingly feeling the financial strain of subsidizing North Korea, shipping $1.9 billion worth of goods in 1988 while receiving less than $900 million in return. Pyongyang had also defaulted on its Western debt back in 1987.
The brighter Sino-Soviet rapprochement also had a significant impact on Kim Il-sung's position and leverage.
Gorbachev's refusal to visit Pyongyang during his trip to Beijing in May 1989 was a clear sign that North Korea's traditional strategy of balancing between its 2 large communist allies was becoming less effective. The resolution of the Sino-Soviet dispute meant that neither communist power feared pushing Kim into the arms of the other anymore. This caused Kim to worry about losing leverage with both Beijing and Moscow. Gorbachev was quite frank with the Chinese leaders during his visit about the Soviet Union's developing ties with South Korea, noting that China was actually very far behind the PRC in terms of trade volume with Seoul, with China's trade at $3 billion while the Soviet Union's was less than $200 million in 1989. This showed the rapidly changing economic landscape.
While the external diplomatic landscape was shifting back in South Korea, the late 1980s saw a major battle for democracy play out.
Yes, a decisive political struggle centered around President Chun Doo-hwan's attempt to manage his succession while maintaining authoritarian control. In April 1987, Chung banned any further consideration of constitutional revision until after the 1988 Seoul Olympics. His clear intention was to use the existing system of an electoral college to dictate his successor, ensuring continued military-backed rule. Washington reportedly had only brief advance notice of this move.
How did the U.S. respond to this attempt to circumvent democratic reforms?
President Reagan sent Chung a letter, carefully couched in what the source describes as sympathetic, gentle, and inoffensive language, reflecting Reagan's preferred style when dealing with allies, even strongmen. It was framed as a letter from a friend and even applauded Chun's stated commitment to a peaceful transfer of power, which Chung had already announced. But despite the soft language, the unmistakable meaning was a clear message from Washington urging political rather than military solutions to the looming succession crisis. It was a signal that the U.S. supported a more open political process.
This led to the major crisis on the streets of South Korea in June 1987.
Widespread and increasingly passionate demonstrations erupted across the country against Chun's plan to effectively choose his successor. A crucial turning point occurred within the South Korean military itself. Younger generals and colonels were reportedly alarmed by preparations being made to potentially use military force against the growing number of protesters. They took their concerns directly to Roh Tae-woo, who was a key figure in the military establishment and Chun's chosen successor. Roh, in turn, strongly recommended against using military force to Chung. The fact that elements within the military themselves felt that the army should not be mobilized against its own people was a significant sign of growing maturity and a professionalization of the South Korean military, distancing it from its past role in suppressing dissent.
And Roh Tae-woo played a pivotal role in resolving this crisis.
He did. On June 29, 1987, in a dramatic move that surprised many, Roh Tae-woo made a public declaration promising direct presidential elections and other significant democratic reforms, including restoring the civil rights of opposition figures like Kim Dae-jung. This decision, known as the June 29 Declaration, was a fundamental turning point in South Korea's long struggle for full democracy.
Despite his background as a former general involved in the 1979 coup, Roh Tae-woo went on to win the subsequent direct presidential election in December 1987.
He won in a fragmented opposition field. His campaign included a notable pledge to pursue what he called Nordpolitik, specifically targeting improved relations with socialist countries, with a particular emphasis on China. This campaign pledge resonated in economically less developed West Coast areas and helped him win in places like Incheon, which had traditionally been an opposition stronghold. Reflecting later, Roh mused that entering politics, despite his long-held belief that soldiers shouldn't be involved, may be the will of heaven. This is my destiny. Oberdorfer contrasts Chun's leadership style as a very simple man who sees pictures in black and white, with Roh describing him as a man of environment and situation, calculating and cautious, and notably interested in the arts, suggesting a different kind of leader taking the helm.
Roh Tae-woo's presidency coincided with South Korea's triumphant arrival on the world stage as the host of the 1988 Seoul Olympics.
The Seoul Olympics in September 1988 was a massive event for South Korea, a real coming-out party that dramatically showcased its remarkable economic development and growing global presence to the world. While South Korea and the International Olympics Committee offered Pyongyang a few events to co-host, it was never a serious possibility for full co-hosting. Crucially, a boycott by the Soviet bloc countries, which had boycotted the 1984 LA Games, was also not going to happen this time. Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze had made this clear to Pyongyang back in January 1986. Soviet officials even actively participated in preparations in Seoul, though reportedly requesting minimal publicity to avoid upsetting North Korea.
Just before the Olympics, though, there was a significant and deadly provocation from the North.
In November 1987, yes, North Korea orchestrated the bombing of Korean Air Flight 858. This act was widely seen as North Korea's desperate attempt to disrupt either the upcoming Seoul Olympics or the South Korean presidential election. Two North Korean espionage agents, a veteran named Kim Song-il and a younger agent on her first operational mission named Kim Hyun-hui, planted a time bomb on the plane in Baghdad before disembarking in Abu Dhabi. The bomb exploded later over the Andaman Sea, killing all 115 people on board. The agents were captured, and Kim Hyun-hui confessed, providing detailed accounts of the plot and her training.
Against this backdrop of both preparation for a global showcase and violent provocation, President Roh Tae-woo actively pursued his Nordpolitik policy.
As mentioned, this policy was explicitly designed to improve relations with socialist countries, leveraging South Korea's economic power. China was the highest priority. Unofficial contacts with China had been developing quietly for some time, including hundreds of Chinese athletes participating in the 1986 Asian Games held in Seoul, a significant step at the time.
This led eventually to the major diplomatic breakthrough of Sino-South Korean normalization of relations.
Yes, China became the absolute highest priority for Ro's Nordpolitik. The process accelerated, leading to a meeting between Chinese Foreign Minister Chiang Kai-shek and President Roh Tae-woo in Seoul in November 1991 during an APEC meeting. This was the first meeting ever between a Chinese foreign minister and a South Korean president. South Korea's skillful handling of arrangements for Taiwan and Hong Kong to participate in APEC alongside Beijing apparently won considerable gratitude from China, easing the path towards normalization. The agreement on full diplomatic normalization was reached in July 1992, but China delayed the public announcement until August 24th to give them time to prepare Pyongyang. Foreign Minister Chiang Kai-shek personally took the news to Pyongyang, reportedly stating that the decision was an order from senior leader Deng Xiaoping, leaving the North Koreans little room to object or prevent it.
Meanwhile, Washington also took steps to align with Seoul's initiatives and try to reduce tensions on the peninsula.
In 1988, the U.S. launched a modest initiative to signal flexibility towards North Korea. This included allowing substantive discussions with North Koreans to take place in neutral settings for the first time in years. They also listed 5 areas they saw as potential encouraging symbols for a more constructive relationship. Progress in North-South dialogue, the return of MIA remains, the elimination of anti-U.S. propaganda, confidence-building measures along the DMZ, and credible assurances on terrorism. Significantly, no specific North Korean steps were required beforehand, although Pyongyang was asked for a positive response.
And these steps were carefully coordinated with Seoul.
Absolutely. These American measures were discussed in detail with President Roh Tae-woo during his October 1988 visit to the U.S., and they received his full approval. He asked that the public announcement be delayed until after his return to Seoul, which the U.S. agreed to. A State Department cable from the time emphasized that these measures were being taken both to stay in step with, but not in advance of, the ROKG, the Republic of Korea government, and because the U.S. had substantial interests of our own in seeking to reduce tensions and in promoting dialogue on the peninsula. This shows a coordinated strategy between Washington and Seoul.
Moving into the late 1980s and early 1990s, one of the most significant shifts was Moscow's change in posture, effectively, well, switching sides.
Yes, this is a huge blow to North Korea and a major boon for the South. There were growing Soviet-South Korean ties. Contacts increased steadily, including a high-level Soviet foreign ministry official secretly visiting Seoul in early 1989 to discuss bilateral relations.
This culminated in a landmark meeting between the leaders.
The Gorbachev-Rose Summit in San Francisco in June 1990. This was the first time a Soviet leader had ever met a South Korean head of state. While it surprised some South Korean officials with its speed, it perfectly aligned with President Roh's Nordpolitik goal of normalizing relations with socialist countries.
Following the summit, there was a busy period focused on economic negotiations.
The focus was very much on Soviet requests for economic aid from the newly prosperous South Korea. A Korean economic delegation visited Moscow in August 1990. They discussed 40 potential projects, but the South Koreans were firm. No significant aid programs could be finalized until full diplomatic relations were established.
And then came Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze's dramatic announcement at the United Nations.
On September 30, 1990, in what was reportedly an impromptu act at the UN, Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze announced that the Soviet Union would recognize South Korea and establish full diplomatic relations. This cleared the way for the economic negotiations that had been discussed and fundamentally altered the diplomatic landscape in Northeast Asia.
How did North Korea react to this abandonment by their longtime major ally?
The reaction from Pyongyang was, predictably, strongly negative and angry. About 3 weeks later, they sent a message denouncing South Korea's actions with the Soviet Union, calling it a betrayal. But significantly, despite the strong denunciation, they also included a proposal to restart preparations for high-level North-South talks. This suggests that while they were furious, they also recognized the shifting power dynamics required a different diplomatic approach.
This led to the initiation of high-level North-South talks in 1990.
Preliminary meetings, facilitated partly by the changed external environment, resulted in an agreement for prime ministerial-level talks, a higher level than most previous exchanges. The North Korean Prime Minister visited Seoul in September 1990, and the South Korean Prime Minister paid a reciprocal visit to Pyongyang in October 1990. These were significant, if ultimately limited, steps.
The combined shifts by both the Soviet Union and China must have put immense pressure on North Korea and Kim Il-sung.
Absolutely. China, for instance, had effectively forced Kim Il-sung to reverse his long-standing principled opposition to dual entry for North and South Korea into the United Nations in the spring of 1991. Beijing was also rapidly moving towards normalizing relations with Seoul themselves. When Kim Il-sung visited China in October 1991, the Chinese leaders were quite blunt. They advised him to open up his economy, settle quickly with South Korea for regional peace, and accept President Bush's withdrawal of tactical nuclear weapons from South Korea as a credible move towards de-escalation. This shows how isolated North Korea was becoming diplomatically.
This external pressure seemed to influence discussions within North Korea's leadership, leading to a significant party meeting.
The Workers' Party's Central Committee held a significant meeting on December 24, 1991. It was notable for several reasons. It was the first party plenum specifically focused on North-South issues in 9 years, indicating the leadership felt the need to address the changing situation. Kim Il-sung praised the recent non-aggression pact signed with the South as an epochal event, and the public report from the meeting contained no criticism of South Korea or the United States, a departure from standard propaganda. But the meeting was even more significant for two other reasons, according to Oberdorfer's sources. First, Kim Jong-il was named Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces in December 1991, a major step in his formal succession process. Second, and critically for the international community, the party apparently gave clearances for international inspection of the nuclear program and for a bilateral nuclear accord to be worked out with the South. According to longtime observer Selig Harrison, this marked a conditional victory for pragmatists within the regime who argued for seeking a deal compromising on the nuclear issue to gain economic benefits and normalization with the U.S. and Japan. Hardliners reportedly agreed only to suspend the program, not terminate it, betting that foreign help wouldn't actually materialize.
So after this period of diplomatic momentum and internal shifts in North Korea, the peninsula quickly entered a new phase, the nuclear crisis.
Yeah, the period from late 1992 to early 1993 saw a dramatic and disheartening shift. The cautious hope and limited euphoria that had followed North Korea's seeming openness to nuclear inspection gave way to deep suspicion and renewed antagonism. The rewards Pyongyang expected from opening up didn't materialize, or at least not fast enough. Instead, the presence of international inspectors became a focal point for accusations and disputes. A worsening political climate between North and South due to campaigning for South Korean elections also contributed, as did the fact that the U.S. was largely distracted by its own presidential election.
The Team Spirit military exercise, which had been a perennial point of contention, also became controversial again.
Oh, absolutely. The cancellation of the massive U.S.-South Korea Team Spirit exercise in 1992 had been seen by North Korea as perhaps the most tangible evidence of improved relations, and was a significant benefit to their cash-strapped military. They genuinely feared it as an invasion threat, viewing it as a rehearsal for attacking the North, while the U.S. tended to scoff at this characterization. But the sheer scale of the exercise involving hundreds of thousands of troops, troop landings, flights by nuclear-capable planes, undeniably made a strong impression. Kim Il-sung himself reportedly discussed the resumption of Team Spirit with a U.S. congressman in 1993, with his voice quivering and hands shaking with anger, calling it a dress rehearsal for an invasion. The U.S. decision to reinstate Team Spirit in 1993 was a major setback for efforts to build trust.
There was also an incident involving a spy ring discovered in the South that further chilled relations.
Right. In October 1992, shortly after North Korea had agreed to IAEA inspections, South Korea announced the arrest of a large North Korean spy ring operating in the South. This happened even as President Roh Tae-woo had authorized joint economic development missions to Pyongyang as part of his Sunshine Policy approach. Interestingly, the South Korean intelligence agency reportedly opposed these missions, preferring a harder line. After the news of the spy ring broke, which a former official suggested might have been greatly exaggerated or fabricated by elements within the South Korean government opposed to engagement, President Roh was forced to cancel the planned economic missions due to intense public indignation. As the former spokesman for the South-North talks recalled, everything stopped.
The focus of the nuclear issue then shifted specifically to international inspections and potential undeclared sites in the North.
North Korea had agreed to IAEA safeguards in 1991, and inspections began. However, attention quickly turned to two specific suspect sites near the Yongbyon nuclear complex. The IAEA identified these based on analysis of U.S. satellite photos, suspecting they were unacknowledged nuclear waste sites that could potentially reveal information about North Korea's past plutonium production beyond what they had declared. There was even initially puzzling visibility of the Yongbyon complex itself on satellite imagery. One Energy Department analyst suggested it might even be a chemical fiber factory, while a former senior official noted the real problem was less about technical analysis and more about policymakers' reluctance to face the gravity of the issue.
This led to a direct escalation with the IAEA.
IEA Director General Hans Blix formally requested visits to these two suspect sites in December 1992 to clarify their purpose and contents. North Korea refused in January 1993, stating unequivocally that a visit could not be considered an inspection and that inspections of what they termed non-nuclear military facilities might jeopardize their supreme interests. That's a direct reference to the escape clause in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, that allows a country to withdraw if its supreme interests are jeopardized. They also explicitly asked Blix to consider the broader political and military situation, signaling that the nuclear issue was tied to the security environment.
From South Korea's perspective, Foreign Minister Han Seung-jo outlined the key concerns they faced.
He saw the primary concerns as a kind of cascade of potentially catastrophic events. First, North Korea actually succeeding in producing nuclear weapons. Second, the risk of war breaking out as a direct result of a strong international reaction to this development. Third, the almost inevitable demand within South Korea to match the North's nuclear capability, potentially triggering a dangerous regional arms race with Japan. And fourth, the destruction of the international non-proliferation regime, which South Korea saw as vital to its security.
The crisis deepened significantly in March 1993.
With North Korea's startling announcement on March 12, 1993, that it was withdrawing from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This move sent shockwaves internationally and was seen as a major step towards potentially developing nuclear weapons unchecked.
This dramatic step prompted the start of direct U.S.-North Korea talks in June 1993.
With the NPT withdrawal announcement, the U.S. felt compelled to engage directly. Talks resumed in New York City. The initial meetings were difficult. The North Korean negotiator gave the obligatory lengthy speech about Kim Il-sung and the Juche system, which the Americans found, well, tedious and depressing. The talks didn't go far initially, with North Korea adamant about not staying in the NPT and the U.S. demanding they reverse their withdrawal. They went nowhere, and the U.S. team essentially told the North Koreans to call them if they had something genuinely new to propose.
President Clinton visited the DMZ in July 1993, delivering a very blunt public message to North Korea.
President Clinton visited Korea just before the second round of U.S.-North Korean talks. He traveled to the bridge of no return at the edge of the DMZ, getting closer than previous presidents had ventured. Standing there, he addressed a press pool and publicly stated with unmistakable clarity that it is pointless for North Koreans to try to develop nuclear weapons because if they ever use them, it would be the end of their country. This was a direct, stark warning.
The second round of talks in Geneva in July 1993 introduced a new element into the negotiations: the idea of light water reactors, or LWRs.
North Korea raised the possibility of receiving light water reactors, which are different from their existing graphite-moderated reactors and produce less weapons-grade plutonium under normal operation in exchange for freezing their program. While this idea was relatively new to most of the American negotiators, like Chief Negotiator Robert Gallucci, the quest for LWRs actually had a history for North Korea. They had requested Soviet LWRs back in the mid-1980s, and DPRK Deputy Premier Kim Dahl-haeon had proposed South-North cooperation on an LWR plant back in July 1992. Gallucci was initially skeptical due to the immense costs involved, over $1 billion per reactor, but he also saw possibilities for international control and verification with such a project.
The period around late 1993 and early 1994 became known as a war scare due to the escalating nuclear tensions.
The atmosphere was incredibly tense and volatile. President Clinton reportedly said in an interview that North Korea probably had one nuclear bomb, though the White House later clarified he misspoke, stating he meant they had enough plutonium for one bomb theoretically. Polls in the U.S. show that North Korea's nuclear weapon development was Americans' most serious foreign policy problem. In November 1993, North Korea made its proposed package solution public, outlining elements they were willing to consider, although they didn't reveal the earlier history of these ideas.
Even prominent private citizens got involved in trying to defuse the situation.
Yes, Reverend Billy Graham made his second visit to Pyongyang in January 1994. Graham had a special personal connection to the city because his wife, Ruth Bell Graham, had spent part of her youth there when her father was a medical missionary. He carried a blunt, unadored message from President Clinton, cooperated on the nuclear issue, and only then could relations improve. The note reportedly had no salutations or good wishes, just a very direct statement of the U.S. position.
A critical turning point in the crisis, pushing things closer to conflict, was the defueling crisis in mid-1994.
This centered on North Korea's 5-megawatt reactor at Yongbyon. The concern was the spent fuel rods being removed from the reactor. U.S. intelligence calculated that it was theoretically possible to obtain plutonium for 1 or 2 nuclear weapons from a full load of these rods, although it would require difficult additional reprocessing steps that North Korea wasn't confidently known to be capable of at that exact moment. The core dispute remained the 2 suspect sites that the IAEA wanted to visit for special inspections to clarify North Korea's nuclear past. From Pyongyang's perspective, allowing verifiable unloading was a no-win situation. If they showed no diversion, they would lose their main bargaining power, the potential plutonium. If they showed they had lied about their past program, they would lose face and trigger an intensified international hunt for missing material.
And North Korea proceeded with removing the fuel rods without international observation or approval.
Spent fuel rod removal began on May 8, 1994, without international oversight. To the shock of the IAEA inspectors present, the operations proceeded rapidly, with North Korea even using a second homemade defueling machine. In late May, the IAEA team, headed by Dmitry Perekos, failed to get North Korea to slow down the process or accept verification methods for the fuel rods. This deliberate move to prevent verification significantly escalated the crisis.
This increasingly dangerous situation led to very serious U.S. and ROK war planning.
As the crisis deepened, a massive U.S. and RO counterattack plan, known as O-Plan 5027, was developed and refined. This plan reportedly involved taking Pyongyang and potentially reunifying the country, with significant emphasis placed on pre-hostility steps and preparations. In a controversial move, South Korean Defense Minister Lee Pyeong-tae publicly outlined elements of this plan in March 1994, stating it was intended as a deterrent. This startled many U.S. officers, but reflected the South Koreans becoming nervous as a cat, as one put it, genuinely thinking we were going to war too because of the perceived imminent threat.
Secretary of Defense William Perry viewed this period, specifically the defueling, as a fundamental shift in strategy.
Perry identified the defueling of the Yongbyon reactor as the critical turning point, where what he called preventive diplomacy had essentially failed. The strategy then necessarily shifted to coercive diplomacy, involving the threat of sanctions and military pressure. Military planners saw the unverified fuel rods as a tangible, immediate threat, fearing that North Korea could quickly develop a small arsenal of nuclear weapons for threats, blackmail, or even sale to other actors. Perry stated that it was even more dangerous to allow North Korea to proceed with reprocessing the rods than to take potentially risky action to stop them.
This led to a strong push for UN Security Council sanctions against North Korea.
The U.S. aggressively drove for UN sanctions. A principal, stated purpose of this push was to press China to use its considerable influence on North Korea to defuse the situation. South Korean Foreign Minister Han Sung-jo reportedly told his Chinese counterpart, Jan Kichin, quite directly that the only way for China to avoid being forced to vote on sanctions at the Security Council was to persuade North Korea to back down and defuse the nuclear situation.
The situation came to a head with an IAEA vote and North Korea's reaction.
The IAEA Board of Governors voted in June 1994 to suspend technical assistance to North Korea's nuclear program as a punitive measure. Notably, the Chinese ambassador abstained rather than voting against the measure, signaling Beijing's displeasure with Pyongyang's actions. In response, North Korea announced its withdrawal from the IAEA, expelled the inspectors who were still in the country, and refused to cooperate further, effectively ending all international surveillance of its nuclear activities and significantly increasing alarm worldwide.
With the diplomatic route seemingly exhausted and inspection gone, prominent voices began advocating for military action.
Yes, figures like former Bush administration officials Brent Scowcroft and Arnold Cantor publicly advocated for a U.S. military strike to destroy the Yongbyon reprocessing plant unless North Korea immediately permitted monitoring. They wrote in a widely noted opinion piece that the stakes could hardly be higher, the time for temporizing is over, arguing for decisive action.
This escalating tension and the lack of diplomatic progress culminated in a key U.S. decision meeting.
On June 16, 1994, President Clinton held a high-level meeting in the White House Cabinet Room to discuss the crisis. At this meeting, he gave final approval for the drive for UN sanctions. General John Shelikashvili, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, also outlined the significant military buildup that would be required on the peninsula in preparation for potential conflict, a buildup that would require a limited call-up of U.S. reserve forces. The peninsula seemed on the brink.
In the midst of this incredibly tense environment, former President Jimmy Carter undertook a highly unusual independent mission to North Korea.
Yes, In June 1994, just as the U.S. was pushing for sanctions and planning military options, while some of the North Korean leadership, potentially including Kim Jong-il, might have been unenthusiastic about the idea of a summit with South Korea's President Kim Young-sam, Oberdorfer's sources suggest that Kim Il-sung himself was planning energetically for such a meeting, perhaps seeing it as a way out of the mounting international pressure.
And Kim Il-sung made a significant and unexpected offer to Carter.
During Carter's visit, yes, Kim Il-sung offered Carter a summit meeting with South Korean President Kim Young-sam. This was a major development, as North Korea had long sought to exclude the South from high-level discussions with the U.S.
How did Kim Young-sam react when Carter conveyed this offer after leaving the North?
Carter met President Kim Young-sam at the Blue House in Seoul after his trip. Kim Young-sam was reportedly initially cool towards Carter, feeling that the fate of the peninsula had been discussed at a high level by outsiders without his full participation. But when Carter conveyed Kim Il-sung's summit offer, Kim Young-sam's demeanor changed dramatically. He became visibly excited by the prospect of a historic inter-Korean summit. Within an hour, he announced his acceptance of an early and unconditional summit, transforming Carter's independent mission into a powerful catalyst for potential rapprochement and creating a surge of hope for a breakthrough.
Tragically, that historic summit never took place.
No, because just weeks later, on July 8, 1994, Kim Il-sung died suddenly at the age of 82 from a heart attack.
What was the immediate impact of this news in South Korea?
Within minutes of the news breaking, President Kim Young-sam placed all ROK armed forces on maximum alert, fearing potential instability or provocation from the North during the leadership transition. Emergency meetings were quickly convened at the Blue House to assess the situation.
And in North Korea?
All visible activity seemed to stop. DPRK forces virtually stopped training, and any visible movements apparently focused entirely on mourning and funeral preparations for the great leader. The U.S. command and the Carter administration remained concerned about potential North Korean attempts to exploit the turmoil or instability that might follow, though none materialized immediately.
Kim Jong-il then formally succeeded his father. How did he compare to Kim Il-sung?
Kim Jong-il's succession brought a stark contrast in leadership styles and backgrounds. Kim Il-sung was the guerrilla fighter, the founder of the state, charismatic and relatively comfortable in public. Kim Jong-il, on the other hand, grew up in privilege, never served in the military until being named Supreme Commander in 1991, was reportedly uncomfortable in large crowds, and for many years remained a figure of much mystery to the outside world. His rise within the party was unacknowledged for years under the euphemism, the party center. He rarely saw foreigners and reportedly only traveled abroad twice before 1994. Details like his interest in film and musicals are noted, and he was even credited with production roles in the early 1970s. Songs were sung about him, and cadres carried special notebooks for his instructions. He was openly proclaimed successor as Dear Leader in 1980. There are also notorious stories of his high living and the bizarre incident of the 1978 kidnapping of prominent South Korean actress Choi Yoon-hee and director Shin Sang-ok on his direct orders, reportedly to improve North Korea's film industry.
Despite the transition and the mystery surrounding the new leader, negotiations with the U.S. resumed fairly quickly, leading to the agreed framework.
Yes, U.S.-North Korea negotiations led by Chief Negotiator Robert Gallucci resumed in late 1994 after Kim Il-sung's death and made rapid progress, surprising many U.S. officials. The prevailing assessment was that there was pressure on the new leadership, Kim Jong-il, to quickly produce a major deal that would enhance his stature and consolidate his power during the transition period. Gallucci himself believed that the combination of the June 1994 sanctions threat and the public U.S. military buildup were crucial factors that drove Pyongyang back to the negotiating table, with a strong desire to settle the nuclear issue. He called it a very good combination of political-military activity.
The North Koreans came to the table with their chips, as their negotiator called them.
As North Korean negotiator Kang Sok-ju described them, their main chips in the negotiation were the 8,000 irradiated fuel rods removed from the Yongbyon reactor, the existence of the reprocessing facility that could produce plutonium, and the mandatory IAEA special inspections of the suspect sites, which could potentially reveal the full scope of their nuclear past. The U.S. also had important bargaining chips, primarily the promise of lifting sanctions and improving relations.
But the demand for special inspections was the major hurdle in reaching an agreement.
Absolutely. The demand for special inspections to clarify North Korea's nuclear history, whether they had produced more plutonium than declared in the past using those undeclared sites, was the thorniest issue. It was this demand that had triggered North Korea's NPT withdrawal announcement 18 months earlier, and they had publicly vowed never to submit to such inspections of what they deemed military facilities. Gallucci had firm instructions from Washington that special inspections must be part of any deal. It remained a major deal breaker right up until both sides showed crucial flexibility on the timing.
And that flexibility ultimately led to the signing of the October 1994 agreed framework.
The core components of the accord were a reciprocal agreement. North Korea would completely freeze its existing graphite-moderated reactors and related facilities, including the controversial reprocessing plant, under international monitoring. In exchange, an international consortium, the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization, KEDO, would provide North Korea with 2 proliferation-resistant light water reactors and supply heavy fuel oil shipments as an interim energy source to compensate for the energy lost by shutting down their reactors. Crucially, the contentious special inspections to clarify North Korea's nuclear past were postponed until a later stage in the process, specifically when key components of the new light water reactors were delivered years down the line.
However, this framework faced strong opposition from South Korea's President Kim Young-sam.
President Kim Young-sam reacted very negatively and emotionally when briefed on the details of the agreed framework, particularly the postponement of special inspections. He reportedly had an outburst to Gallucci and other U.S. officials, fearing the accord would be a betrayal of South Korea's interests and would torpedo the prospects for meaningful North-South dialogue, which he had hoped would be central. He strongly objected to postponing the special inspections, which he had promised his people would happen quickly, and the absence of a direct North-South aspect in the core of the deal. Ambassador James Laney appealed to Kim to maintain unity with the U.S. for the greater goal of curbing Pyongyang's nuclear program, while assuring him the U.S. was still seeking a commitment from North Korea to resume North-South dialogue. But Kim flatly stated he could not approve the deal in its current form due to promises he had made to his people regarding immediate inspections.
The delicate relationship was tested again shortly after the agreed framework was signed.
In December 1994, yes, a U.S. Army helicopter pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Bobby Hall, was captured after his helicopter inadvertently drifted across the DMZ into North Korea. After being held and reportedly making a confession, North Korea requested a senior State Department official, Thomas Hubbard, to arrange his release, deliberately bypassing normal military channels and the UN command. Hubbard traveled to the border and famously crossed the DMZ to secure the pilot's release. This incident highlighted North Korea's preference for dealing directly with the U.S. and its willingness to create incidents to force high-level engagement.
You visited North Korea again in January 1995, shortly after the agreed framework was signed. What were your impressions then, particularly regarding the economic situation?
My impressions were stark, particularly compared to South Korea. The small Russian plane I was on was, remarkably, the only one landing in the entire country that day. A stark contrast to Seoul's busy Gimpo Airport, which was handling over 40,000 passengers daily on constant jumbo jets. My overwhelming impression was that North Korea's economy was on the rocks, as I put it. Outside estimates suggested it was entering its 6th consecutive year of negative growth, with GNP having contracted by a 4th since 1990. However, it was interesting to note that I saw little visible privation in the capital, Pyongyang, where the population is specially chosen and privileged. In fact, I noticed more cars, trucks, and buses circulating than during my 1991 visit, suggesting that while the country faced a severe energy crisis overall, access to energy might have eased somewhat for residents of the capital city.
The agreed framework quickly faced disputes, notably over the reactors it promised.
Yes. In March 1995, a major dispute arose over the name and origin of the new light water reactors to be supplied. North Korea threatened to abandon the agreed framework entirely. Seoul demanded that North Korea clearly acknowledge that the reactors would be South Korean standard models and largely built by South Korean companies, as this was absolutely necessary for the South Korean National Assembly to authorize the billions of dollars required for funding the project. In critical talks held in Berlin, South Korea's negotiators refused to approve face-saving language proposed by the U.S. to smooth over the North's objections. As a White House policymaker involved noted, they made a conscious choice between pursuing what we thought was the most likely route to a solution adopting U.S. language and solidarity with the South. We opted for solidarity. Predictably, the talks failed initially, highlighting the importance of Seoul's role and influence.
Meanwhile, North Korea was facing a rapidly worsening and severe food shortage across the country.
The food shortage became a major widespread crisis throughout the 1990s. They quietly began asking various countries for help. In the early 1990s, they had secretly requested 500,000 tons of rice from South Korea, but the idea was dropped when Seoul said it would be impossible to hide such large shipments in its open society. After a particularly poor harvest in 1992, the regime had even resorted to propagandizing "let's eat 2 meals a day" as a goal, reflecting the growing scarcity. Although DPRK officials mentioned severe food problems during the 1994 Geneva talks, the U.S. negotiating team was so focused on the nuclear issue that they reportedly didn't give it sufficient attention or follow up effectively at the time.
South Korea's President Kim Young-sam seemed to have fluctuating views on the severity of the situation in North Korea.
His public and private assessments varied. In July 1995, he reportedly told President Clinton that he thought the North Koreans were going down the tubes and the South should seek gradual change rather than collapse. But by November 1995, after severe floods hit North Korea, he told Vice President Gore that there was no possibility of a soft landing, there's going to be a crash, indicating a belief that the regime was on the verge of collapse.
And South Korea's stance on providing food aid to the starving North was controversial and seemed tied to domestic politics.
In January 1996, President Kim Young-sam took a public stance strongly opposing additional food aid, calling it a crime and a betrayal for North Korea to seek aid while maintaining its large military forces. And aid explicitly linked this tough public stance to domestic political considerations ahead of upcoming South Korean elections in April. South Korea wasn't just unresponsive to appeals from the UN and humanitarian organizations for aid, they also actively sought to dissuade other countries from providing assistance, arguing either that North Korea's plight wasn't truly serious or that aid should be strictly conditioned on the North resuming meaningful dialogue with the South. In contrast, Washington signaled its humanitarian concern by making a $2 million unconditional contribution to the UN appeal, implicitly distancing itself from Seoul's hardline approach to aid at that moment. Despite the severe economic crisis and food shortages, there were also signs of the military's growing clout within the North Korean regime in the late 1990s. As Kim Jong-il solidified his succession after his father's death, the Korean People's Army, KPA, seemed to be gaining significant influence and prominence. Since Kim Il-sung's death, most of Kim Jong-il's public appearances were visits to military units, signaling the military's importance. High-ranking military officers were increasingly elevated into key party and state positions. A military parade was notably staged for the Workers' Party anniversary, with the defense minister, not a civilian party official, giving the keynote speech, an event previously non-military. However, even at the military's rising status, Kim Jong-il seemed to hold the military in check on key issues regarding the United States, reportedly overruling objections regarding the agreed framework and the handling of the captured U.S. pilot Bobby Hull.
But there were also unpublicized signs of potential disarray or problems within the KPA itself.
Oberdorfer notes two unpublicized developments in late 1995 that suggested internal problems. The KPA 6th Corps was reportedly disbanded, its leadership purged, and units submerged under circumstances that suggested disarray or internal issues. Also, the annual large-scale winter military maneuvers were suddenly halted 2 months early and replaced instead by intensive ideological education. This appeared to reflect not only resource scarcity, making large maneuvers difficult, but also potential problems with indoctrination and discipline within the ranks, requiring a renewed focus on political loyalty.
A significant and dangerous incident occurred in September 1996, again highlighting the tension around the DMZ.
A North Korean Shark-class submarine carrying infiltrators ran aground on South Korea's coast near the city of Gangneung and was discovered by a vigilant cab driver. This triggered a massive manhunt and military mobilization, involving some 40,000 ROK troops, backed by helicopter gunships and search dogs. A particularly grisly scene was discovered on a mountain. 11 infiltrators found executed by bullets to the back of the head, evidently by consent in a collective suicide pact to avoid capture by South Korean forces.
How did this incident affect the assessment of the military balance on the peninsula?
USFK Commander General John Tilelli offered an assessment following the incident. He believed that North Korean forces had been degraded by years of economic shortages and lack of resources, while U.S. and South Korean forces had continued to modernize. The overall balance had shifted, he said, but it was impossible to know exactly by how much. Critically, he noted that despite their resource issues, the DPRK military remained highly capable, relying on mass and asymmetrical tactics over modernization, and that it might be the only viable instrument of national power the regime has left in the face of economic collapse.
The submarine incident also created significant tensions, not just between North and South, but also between the U.S. and South Korea.
Relations were extremely tense following the incident. both the direct North-South relationship and, surprisingly, between the U.S. and ROK. The source includes a quote attributed to David Christoph that some U.S. officials feel that their biggest headache on the peninsula is the government in the South, not the North. Oberdorfer confirms hearing similar sentiments from American officials at the time, frustrated by what they saw as Seoul's sometimes unpredictable political reactions and policy rigidity, especially regarding aid.
President Clinton and Kim Young-sam attempted to address the submarine issue in a meeting in Manila in November 1997.
They met and agreed on a joint statement that carefully avoided Kim Young-sam's demand for direct apology from North Korea for the incursion. Instead, the statement called on the North to take acceptable steps to resolve the incident and reduce tension. However, just 3 days later, likely due to domestic political criticism back home, Kim Young-sam reverted to publicly demanding a full apology from North Korea, undermining the carefully crafted joint position.
The submarine issue was eventually settled through diplomacy in December 1997.
U.S.-led efforts, specifically discreet talks between U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary Mark Minton and North Korean official Lee Hyung-chol, resulted in a settlement. North Korea issued a statement expressing deep regret for the incident and pledging no recurrence. They also agreed to attend a briefing on the proposed four-power peace talks involving the U.S., China, North Korea, and South Korea. As part of a package deal, Washington resumed heavy fuel oil supply under the agreed framework, Seoul removed its objections to the Kido light water reactor work, and North Korea permitted the preservation of the spent fuel rods. South Korea, in turn, agreed to return the remains of the killed infiltrators. However, North Korean officials were reportedly shocked and upset to receive only cremated ashes, as U.S. officers involved believed the bodies were too riddled with bullets to be presented respectfully as full remains.
While dealing with these external tensions and the nuclear crisis, South Korea was also grappling with major political scandals in the mid to late 1990s.
The period saw significant internal political turmoil. In 1995, former President Roh Tae-woo made a dramatic mea culpa statement, admitting to having secretly amassed vast sums of money a secret fund received while in office from businessmen. A poll at the time named him the most loathsome politician. Opposition leader Kim Dae-jung also later admitted that he had secretly accepted 2 billion won from Roh's fund, which tarnished his image. Kim Dae-jung then accused the incumbent president Kim Young-sam of having received much more. Kim Young-sam denied receiving money personally, but did not deny that his political party might have received funds.
This led to trials for the former presidents.
Both Chun Doo-hwan and Roh Tae-woo were put on trial from March to August 1996 on serious charges including bribery, insurrection, and treason related to the 1979 coup and the 1980 Gwangju suppression. Former aides and heads of major conglomerates were also implicated. The trials navigated complex legal issues, including the constitutionality of applying treason charges retroactively. Chun was defiant, going on a hunger strike, while Roh expressed remorse. Despite the convictions and sentences, President Kim Young-sam ultimately pardoned both Chun and Roh in December 1997, allowing them to return to private life, a controversial decision seen by some as a step towards national reconciliation.
Moving into the late 1990s and the turn of the millennium, despite the ongoing crisis, there were signs that Pyongyang was beginning to shift, potentially towards an aid-based state model and renewed diplomacy.
Senior officials in both the U.S. and South Korea identified the final months of 1998 as a period when important shifts began to become visible within the North Korean regime. The Supreme People's Assembly meeting on September 5, 1998, named Kim Jong-il as the governmental leader by confirming him as head of the National Defense Commission, which was declared the highest post in the state. Two other significant changes occurred at this meeting. An amendment to the Constitution was adopted that introduced elements of a Chinese-style socialist market economy, acknowledging the need for some economic reform, and a significant number of younger, more pragmatic bureaucrats were brought into the cabinet, 23 new faces out of 34 positions. These changes reportedly bore Kim Jong-il's personal imprimatur and signaled a potential, albeit cautious, move towards adapting to the dire economic circumstances.
This period also saw a significant engagement effort from the U.S. side, led by William Perry.
In late 1999, yes, William Perry, who had served as Secretary of Defense, visited Pyongyang as President Clinton's personal representative, part of a U.S. policy review that ultimately favored engagement over confrontation. His proposals involved North Korea ending missile tests, production, and exports in exchange for the U.S. lifting sanctions and removing North Korea from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. North Korea indicated it would seek compensation in the form of food, clothing, and energy for giving up missile sales. Perry summarized his proposals to senior North Korean official Kang Sok-ju, but later felt his mission had failed, partly due to perceived lack of firm military backing for the proposals, while Korean experts in his party were more optimistic that progress had been made.
Despite these diplomatic efforts, a naval clash occurred in the Yellow Sea in June 1999.
Yes, a naval clash erupted between North and South Korean vessels. This incident had significant repercussions. Domestically in the South, it actually validated the hard side of newly elected President Kim Dae-jung's sunshine policy, which emphasized engagement but also strength. As he had stated, "We will never tolerate armed provocations." Kim Dae-jung called it a decisive success that taught North Korea a lesson and improved ROK military morale. Politically, it was an embarrassment for the North and, according to some analysis, may have delayed Pyongyang's subsequent movement towards accommodation with the South by 6 months or more.
Despite setbacks like the Yellow Sea clash, Kim Dae-jung continued to pursue his sunshine policy, leading to a truly historic summit.
Kim Dae-jung's sunshine policy was based on the premise that engagement rather than isolation was the best way to bring about change and eventual reconciliation on the peninsula. This approach culminated in the historic summit meeting with Kim Jong-il in Pyongyang in June 2000. This was the first ever meeting between the leaders of the two Koreas since the peninsula was divided.
Why did Kim Jong-il, who had been so reclusive, finally agree to this summit and emerge onto the international stage in this way?
Kim Dae-jung's own analysis was that the single most important reason was North Korea's desperate economic travail. He believed that the extreme need for outside assistance, particularly from South Korea, was essential for the regime's survival. Without improved relations with the South, he argued, other countries wouldn't provide significant aid. Other reasons cited included North Korea's failure to sideline the ROK government while attempting to engage directly with the U.S., the broader global pressure for detente, and, perhaps over time, a growing level of trust in the South's stated policy aimed to assist, not undermine, the North. Scholars also added that Kim Il-sung himself had been actively preparing for a summit before his death, suggesting it was a long-term goal for the regime.
This openness continued with a high-level North Korean visit to the United States.
In October 2000, Vice Marshal Jo Myung-rook visited Washington as a special envoy from Kim Jong-il. He was the highest-level North Korean official to visit the U.S. up to that point. His background was notable. He'd been a minor aide to Kim Il-sung and a military pilot, but rose rapidly after Kim Il-sung's death in 1994 to become second only to Kim Jong-il as first vice chairman of the National Defense Commission. Despite being a career military professional, he was also chair of the powerful General Political Department of the Army, a key position for protecting Kim Jong-il's interests within the military.
And during this visit, Jo Myung-rook made a significant offer regarding North Korea's missile program.
In Washington, yes. Jo Myung-rook made a significant offer. North Korea was willing to give up further production and deployment of its long-range missiles. He also indicated a willingness to discuss what a ban on foreign sales of these missiles might entail, including accepting compensation in the form of food, clothing, energy, instead of the hard currency they desperately needed for missile exports. This showed North Korea was willing to put some of its most valuable military assets on the table in exchange for aid and normalization.
Wow. This deep dive through excerpts from Don Oberdorfer's The Two Koreas has covered a truly tumultuous history, hasn't it? From the arbitrary force division and the brutal Korean War to periods of intense tension, tentative and often failed dialogue attempts, crises like the nuclear standoff and widespread economic collapse, and then these surprising diplomatic breakthroughs like the 2000 Inter-Korean Summit and the high-level U.S. engagement.
It really highlights just how complex, dynamic, and unpredictable the situation on the Korean peninsula has been over decades. Oberdorfer's work captures this through a unique combination of rigorous historical research, deep interviewing, and, firsthand journalistic accounts of events as they unfolded.
And as Don Oberdorfer concludes his book, amidst all this change and upheaval, some fundamental realities remain constant.
Yes, he returns to the basics. While much has transformed within North and South Korea and in their external relations, Korea's geography hasn't changed. It remains, as it has for centuries, at the vital strategic center of Northeast Asia, surrounded by major global powers, China, Japan, and Russia, with the United States also deeply involved.
And crucially, North and South Koreans themselves are no longer just passive factors subject to the whims of external powers.
Exactly. Oberdorfer emphasizes that Koreans, both North and South, through their actions, choices, and struggles, will continue to have a profoundly important impact on their neighbors and on the international scene in the years ahead. The future of the peninsula Whatever path it takes, be it conflict, slow convergence, or something entirely unexpected, will likely unfold with high drama, intense emotion, and powerful consequences.
And he leaves you, our listener, with a final thought that resonates powerfully after tracing this unpredictable history.
His very last sentence in the book serves as both a warning and perhaps a promise. Hold on to your hats. Korea is a land of surprises.
A powerful reminder that the story of the two Koreas is far from over and will almost certainly continue to challenge expectations and command global attention. What a history to unpack.
A truly deep dive into a critical and still unfolding part of modern history.